Anthony Fauci invoked the Fifth Amendment rather than answer Rand Paul's questions about COVID-19's origins, NIH-backed research, and statements Paul says conflict with Fauci's private diary. Now Paul is pushing for an August 5th contempt vote, arguing that Fauci's presidential pardon weakens his reason for remaining silent. But Fauci's lawyers say answering could still expose him to new legal risk. So what can Congress actually force him to reveal, and what happens if he refuses again? Today, we will bypass speculation and examine Paul's contempt strategy, Fauci's defense, and what the vote could actually change. For clear legal and court analysis, verified true crime updates, and honest reporting, subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases. Follow this case as it develops. An August 5th committee vote would not convict Fauci, send him to prison, or immediately make him answer. It would begin another stage. Paul announced the vote after Fauci's subpoenaed appearance before the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee on July 29, 2026. According to Reuters, Fauci refused more than 100 questions while relying on the constitutional protection against compelled self-incrimination. Paul said the pardon removed Fauci's legal basis for staying silent. Former President Joe Biden pardoned Fauci on January 19, 2025, for possible federal offenses committed from January 1, 2014 through the pardon date, as long as they arose from Fauci's listed government service. The pardon does not say Fauci committed a crime. Biden said he was protecting public servants from prosecutions he considered unjustified and politically motivated. Fauci's lawyers focus on what the pardon does not cover. It cannot protect statements made during a 2026 hearing. If Fauci answered and investigators later claimed that an answer was materially false, that allegation would involve new conduct outside the pardon. His lawyers therefore say Paul's repeated calls for prosecution created a reasonable fear that any response could lead to another criminal investigation. Paul rejects that argument. He says an honest answer about pardoned events should not expose Fauci to punishment for those events. In Paul's view, fear that somebody might accuse a witness of lying cannot become a permanent excuse to avoid congressional questioning. Otherwise, a pardoned official could block oversight by claiming that every future answer might be challenged. This is where the dispute stops being simple. The Fifth Amendment protects more than a direct confession. It can also protect an answer that supplies one link in a possible criminal case. Still, the danger must be real enough to justify silence. Embarrassment, public criticism, or damage to a person's reputation alone is not enough. No court examined Fauci's refusals before the hearing, so neither side currently has a ruling proving its interpretation. That legal neutrality matters. Invoking the Fifth is not an admission of guilt. A contempt resolution is not a conviction. Paul has accused Fauci of misleading Congress about NIH-supported research in Wuhan and helping conceal information about COVID-19's origins. Fauci denies those accusations and says his earlier testimony was truthful. As of August 1st, no criminal court has found that he lied to Congress or participated in a cover-up. The argument began because Paul released 1,141 pages of pandemic-era diary entries covering December 2019 through December 2022. Paul says those records conflict with Fauci's public statements about laboratory origin concerns and research funding. Fauci's representatives say the entries match his public position and show officials considering changing information during a new crisis. The documents exist, but their meaning remains disputed. Their size alone does not prove wrongdoing. COVID-19's origin also remains unresolved. American intelligence agencies have reached different assessments, and some expressed only limited confidence. Nobody can honestly use this hearing to declare either a laboratory incident or natural animal transmission proven. The evidence question is narrower. Do specific dated diary entries conflict with Fauci's dated sworn statements after both are read in their complete context? This deserves careful treatment because the pandemic was not merely a public argument. More than 1 million Americans died, families lost relatives, health workers faced enormous pressure, and government decisions affected everyday life. Those people deserve accurate answers about what officials knew. how scientific uncertainty was handled, and whether public statements reflected the evidence available at the time. They do not benefit from unsupported accusations or the automatic defense of any government official. Paul's immediate strategy is contempt. If the committee approves his resolution, it may advance to the full Senate. Reuters reported that a criminal referral would likely require 60 Senate votes, meaning support from some Democrats could be necessary. Even after Senate approval, Congress could not prosecute Fauci itself. The matter would go to the Justice Department, which would decide whether to ask a grand jury for an indictment. Prosecutors would face several questions. Was the subpoena valid? Were the refused questions relevant to a lawful congressional inquiry? Did Fauci deliberately disobey Congress, or did the Fifth Amendment protect him? Did the pardon eliminate the danger connected to older conduct? And could his new answers expose him to another investigation? Legal experts have said courts have not resolved this exact pardon question under these circumstances. An indictment would still not establish guilt. Fauci would be presumed innocent, his attorneys could challenge the case, and prosecutors would carry the burden of proving every required element beyond a reasonable doubt. That legal process is why viewers should be cautious when anyone speaks as if the August 5th vote will automatically produce an arrest or prison sentence. Congress has another route if obtaining information is its main goal. Under federal law, a Senate committee can seek a court order granting a witness use immunity after meeting certain voting and notice requirements. Once immunized, the witness generally cannot rely on the Fifth Amendment to refuse covered questions. The compelled testimony and evidence obtained from it generally cannot be used against that person in a later criminal prosecution. Immunity does not permit false testimony. A witness can still face consequences for perjury, making a materially false statement, or refusing to comply with the immunity order. Its purpose is to remove the self-incrimination danger while preserving the witness's duty to answer truthfully. That could give Congress a path to Fauci's account, but it could also make a future prosecution harder because investigators would need evidence completely independent of his compelled testimony. Paul therefore faces an important strategic choice. Contempt preserves pressure and the possibility of punishment, yet it may produce no answers. Immunity could force testimony sooner, but it would restrict how that testimony could support a later criminal case. We cannot claim to know Paul's private motive. He has demanded explanations and criminal accountability, but those goals may pull the investigation in different directions. Fauci's broad silence has created concern. He invoked the Fifth even when senators asked basic questions that did not appear incriminating. Critics say that made his claim look excessive. His side can answer that responding selectively might invite an argument that he waived his protection concerning connected subjects. That strategy explains the blanket refusal, but only a court could determine whether every unanswered question was legally protected. Paul's demands for prosecution also cut both ways. They strengthen his claim that he is seeking accountability, but Fauci uses those statements as evidence that answering creates legal danger. Fauci's pardon protects him from covered federal offenses, yet his refusal to discuss those events makes critics question why the pardon has not cleared the way for his testimony. The committee's ranking Democrat, Senator Gary Peters, described the hearing as biased and aimed at supporting a conclusion reached years earlier. Paul says the inquiry concerns legitimate oversight of research funding, government transparency, and the pandemic response. Disagreement between lawmakers does not automatically make a hearing unlawful. If a case develops, the important question will be whether Congress pursued a valid legislative purpose and asked relevant questions. The conclusion is limited. Paul's announced move is an August 5th committee contempt vote. If it fails, this resolution stops at the committee. If it passes, decisions involving the full Senate, federal prosecutors, a grand jury, and possibly a court may follow. No outcome is guaranteed, and the vote itself cannot settle the diary dispute that determined COVID-19's origin or prove that Fauci committed a crime. The central question remains whether Biden's pardon removed the criminal danger connected to Fauci's past government service, or whether possible exposure from his 2026 answers kept the Fifth Amendment available. Until a court examines the exact questions, the pardon's coverage, and the possible legal risks, both positions remain arguments. Paul can increase the pressure, but turning that pressure into testimony or punishment will require far more than one committee vote. And that evidence test begins inside the 1,141 pages Paul released. The records cover December 2019 through December 2022 and contain daily recaps. Paul says selected entries show Fauci privately knew more about a possible laboratory origin and NIH-supported research than he admitted publicly. Fauci's representatives say the entries show an official following evidence during a crisis and expressing the conclusions scientists considered strongest. We need the exact diary entry, the public statement said to conflict with it, the date of each statement, and the information available at both moments. If those details do not line up, a sentence can appear more damaging than it really is. A private note written while facts were changing is not automatically a final scientific conclusion. Each example must stand on its own evidence. Paul has emphasized a January 26, 2020 entry in which Fauci wrote that early information suggested the first known infection was not connected to Wuhan's Huanan market. He described the market as an amplifier rather than the original source. Paul says this conflicts with Fauci's later public support for a natural origin. But the next part of Fauci's note changes how that passage must be read. He also wrote that the virus had jumped from animals to humans somewhere. Those are different questions. One concerns the location of the first human infection. The other concerns how the virus reached humans. Someone could believe the market amplified an outbreak that began elsewhere and still believe an animal transmitted the virus naturally. So the entry alone is not a private admission of a laboratory leak. The timing matters too. Early reports suggested that several of the first identified patients had no known connection to the market. Scientists were asking whether the virus had already been spreading before the market cluster drew attention. Fauci discussed that possibility publicly. In a January 27th interview, he referred to evidence suggesting the first cases might not have started at the market. In February, he said the market may have amplified transmission that was already happening. He said researchers were examining the sequence for evidence of engineering. Paul's broader point is that Fauci publicly leaned toward natural emergence while privately joining discussions about possible laboratory involvement. Fauci's answer is that investigating several possibilities at the beginning is normal scientific work. A concern can be studied and later judged less likely. Right. The public deserves to know whether uncertainty was described honestly and whether stronger private concerns were played down before the evidence justified doing so. That brings us to the February 1st, 2020 conference call. Fauci's notes recorded disagreement among scientists examining features of the virus. Some participants favored natural emergence. Others thought possible construction or laboratory involvement deserved further study. Paul says the notes reveal greater private concern than officials admitted and show the scientific picture was unsettled when work leading to the proximal origin paper began. Officials can be asked what concerns scientists raised, what analysis followed, how opinions changed, and when Fauci learned about those changes. But early disagreement is not proof that the scientists secretly reached a final conclusion, that the virus was engineered. Several participants later said additional genetic analysis moved them away from an engineered explanation and toward natural emergence. If you haven't subscribed, join U.S. crime cases for clear legal analysis, court updates, and verified true crime reporting as this story continues to develop. We should ask what the scientists believed before the call, what worried them during it, what work they performed afterward, and what they eventually published. Moving their later conclusion backward would falsely suggest there was never serious concern. Treating their earliest concern as their permanent conclusion would be equally misleading. Fauci later summarized the discussion as roughly divided before saying further review persuaded the scientists that natural emergence was the better explanation. Paul focuses on the original division because it challenges claims that the issue was obvious from the start. Fauci's defenders focus on the later analysis because scientific judgments are expected to change with evidence. What remains disputed is whether Fauci influenced the paper's conclusions or used it to shut down a laboratory origin discussion too confidently. Paul says his released records justify that suspicion. Fauci denies directing a cover-up, and no court has found that the diary proves one. Later entries show Fauci strongly favored natural emergence. In 2021, he described an animal origin as almost certain, while noting that he had left open the possibility of a laboratory incident. His public record also contains both strong support for natural transmission and acknowledgments that the exact origin remained unresolved. So the real question is not whether he ever mentioned a lab possibility. He did. The question is whether his level of public confidence honestly matched the private information he held at each stage. That cannot be settled by placing two short clips together without dates or context. It requires a complete timeline, including the evidence scientists were reviewing. Paul wanted Fauci to explain that timeline under questioning on July 29th. Fauci's Fifth Amendment response prevented the committee from testing Paul's interpretation directly. Still, his silence did not convert Paul's allegations into established facts. The remaining record consists of the diary, earlier testimony, scientific papers, public interviews, and competing explanations of how they fit together. COVID-19's origin remains unresolved. Some American intelligence agencies have favored a laboratory-related origin, often with low or limited confidence. Other agencies have favored natural transmission or remained undecided. Scientific studies have pointed to early cases clustering around the market, environmental samples there, and animals capable of carrying related viruses. Supporters of a laboratory origin possibility point to coronavirus research in Wuhan, China's limited transparency, and the early concerns raised by scientists. None of those disputes proves Fauci created the virus, caused the pandemic, or knowingly concealed its source. The diary must also be kept in proportion. It is not 1,141 pages of secret confessions. Much of it records calls, meetings, interviews, schedules, and Fauci's workload. Some passages are important because they show what he heard and when he heard it. But the size of the release does not measure the strength of a legal case. One clear material contradiction could matter greatly, while hundreds of routine entries could prove very little. The same evidence test applies to Paul's gain-of-function accusation. Paul argues that NIH-supported work connected to Wuhan involved experiments ordinary people would reasonably describe as making viruses more capable. Fauci has denied lying and says his congressional answers use the federal government's narrower regulatory definition. That disagreement matters because definitions can shape oversight. Congress can ask whether the rules were too narrow, who approved grants, what risks were reviewed, and whether taxpayers received an honest account. But a disagreement over terminology is not automatically a criminal false statement. Prosecutors would generally need to prove that an answer was materially false and that Fauci gave it knowingly and willfully. The precise question, the wording of his answer, the definition he understood, and the documents available to him would all matter. Paul says the records justify more investigation. Fauci says he answered truthfully under the government standard. No criminal judgment has resolved that dispute. We should not lose sight of why honest answers matter. The pandemic left families grieving, patients dealing with lasting effects, health workers under enormous pressure, and communities living with decisions that change daily life. They deserve more than accusations shaped for one political side. They also deserve more than automatic protection of a powerful official. Respect for those people means asking hard questions without inventing conclusions the evidence has not reached. The July 29th hearing could have tested several of these points, including which definition Fauci used and how his private understanding changed. His legal strategy stopped that exchange. That was a loss for transparency, but it did not legally validate Paul's accusations. The public can want Fauci to answer while respecting his constitutional rights. It can support serious oversight while questioning whether Paul's approach is designed to gather facts or preserve a path toward prosecution. So the accurate conclusion is narrow. The January market entry does not, by itself, prove Fauci privately knew the virus came from a laboratory. The February call confirms genuine early disagreement, but does not establish that later scientific conclusions were dishonest. The gain-of-function dispute raises important questions about definitions and oversight, yet it does not independently prove a knowing lie. Paul identified records he says require explanation, and Fauci refused to provide one because he says speaking could create new legal danger. Now the story moves from disputed evidence to practical consequences. If the committee approves Paul's contempt resolution on August 5th, that vote will not decide COVID-19's origin or prove the diary contains a crime. It will begin a separate fight over Congress's subpoena power, Fauci's Fifth Amendment claim, and the limits of his pardon. The next question is what that vote can actually accomplish, which institutions must act afterward, and whether Congress will choose punishment, compelled testimony, or another route entirely. The August 5th committee vote can begin a legal process, but it cannot finish it. The Senate Homeland Security Committee will decide whether Fauci's refusal to answer questions under subpoena should be treated as contempt. Members will not be deciding where COVID-19 began or whether Fauci committed a crime. If the committee rejects the resolution, Paul's immediate contempt effort stops. He could continue investigating, release more documents, question other witnesses, or try another legal strategy. If the committee approves it, the resolution could move to the full Senate. Reuters reported that a criminal referral would likely require 60 votes. Paul may therefore need support from senators outside his party. Even Senate approval would not convict Fauci. Congress cannot indict him, find him guilty, or send him to prison. The referral would go to federal prosecutors who would decide whether to seek charges. A grand jury would then have to approve an indictment. Prosecutors would need to prove that Fauci was properly subpoenaed, that the questions were relevant to the investigation, and that he deliberately refused to answer without a valid legal reason. Fauci appeared at the hearing. The dispute concerns his refusal to answer questions, not a failure to attend. Paul argues that Biden's pardon removed Fauci's danger of prosecution for covered conduct before January 20th, 2025. Fauci's attorneys argue that anything he said during the 2026 hearing would be new conduct outside the pardon. If officials believed an answer was false, they could investigate it as a new offense. That is the legal risk Fauci says allowed him to invoke the Fifth Amendment. No court has settled this exact dispute under these circumstances. A judge may need to examine the pardon, the questions Paul asked, and whether truthful answers could have created a real danger of prosecution. If Fauci were indicted, he would remain presumed innocent. His lawyers could challenge the subpoena, the committee's procedures, and the prosecution itself. They could argue that the case punishes him for exercising a constitutional right. Congress also has another option. It could seek an immunity order compelling Fauci to testify. With immunity, Fauci would generally be required to answer truthfully. His compelled testimony and evidence obtained from it usually could not be used against him in a criminal case. That protection would not cover a new lie, perjury, or another refusal to obey the order. This creates a difficult choice for Paul. Contempt keeps pressure on Fauci, but may produce no answers. Immunity could force answers, but it might make a future prosecution more difficult. Paul has publicly said he wants answers about Fauci's records, NIH-supported research, COVID-19's origin, and earlier testimony before Congress. He has also called for criminal accountability. Those two goals may require different legal strategies. The wording of the August 5th resolution will matter. It should identify the questions Fauci refused, explain why they were relevant, and state why the committee believes his Fifth Amendment claim was invalid. Fauci's attorneys may point to Paul's calls for prosecution as evidence that the danger was real. Paul can respond that every congressional witness must answer honestly, and that fear of being checked against existing records does not automatically justify silence. Both arguments require legal review. The Fifth Amendment does not protect someone from embarrassment or political criticism. It can protect a person when truthful answers could create a genuine connection to possible criminal charges. The pardon complicates the issue because it is broad but limited. It covers certain federal offenses connected to Fauci's government service during a defined period. It does not cover new statements made after that period or conduct outside its terms. Several outcomes are possible. The committee could reject the resolution. It could approve the resolution while the full Senate takes no action. The Senate could approve a criminal referral and allow prosecutors to consider charges. Congress could also change direction and pursue immunity to obtain Fauci's testimony. None of those outcomes is guaranteed. The public should demand clear evidence and equal legal standards. Paul must identify the exact conduct he believes violated the law. Fauci's constitutional argument must be examined seriously, but his government service and pardon do not place his decisions beyond oversight. As of August 1st, 2026, Paul's confirmed next move is the planned August 5th committee vote. Fauci has not been convicted of contempt. No court has ruled that his records prove he lied, and no judge has decided whether all his refusals were legally protected. The committee vote cannot send Fauci directly to prison or settle the debate over COVID-19's origin. It can only begin another stage of the dispute. If Paul chooses contempt, he preserves the possibility of punishment without guaranteeing answers. If Congress chooses immunity, it may obtain testimony while making prosecution more difficult. That is the real decision behind this confrontation, whether the main goal is testimony, punishment, or a court ruling on the limits of Fauci's pardon and Fifth Amendment protection. Thank you for staying until the end. Subscribe for clear legal analysis, verified updates, and every important development as this case moves forward in court.